David? All right. Welcome back from lunch, everybody. I hope it went great and you found some delicious food and you didn't have to fight too hard with the students for the cookies out there. As a not too long ago student myself, I understand the draw of wanting free food. All right, so we have our panel discussion starting now about planning a space for innovation. And in this case, we're mostly going to be referring to a physical space. But if we have a mental space we want to discuss, that's totally fair game too. I am going to let the panelists introduce themselves, as I just found out like this morning that I'd be moderating. Don't worry about it. And I also want to make sure that people get to say their own story. So if you guys could let me know what your names are, where you work now, how you got there, either self-taught or education or through random happenstance, and just kind of like one piece of interesting information that you gleaned from this morning. And I'll start. I'm Ree Zoldak. I am the lead UX person at a company called Calabrio. Unless you work with phone recording, you've probably never heard of us. And that's okay. I started as an anthropology major at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. I graduated with honors 5 years later, sold dog food, decided that was not a career calling. I went back to school for web development and design and had a series of internships. Through those internships, I discovered about information architecture and really, really loved interaction and solving problems with people. So I went into UX, and I wish I would have known that it was a thing probably 10 years sooner than I found out. So that's how I got into the field, and I got into the job I'm at today through diligence and some really fantastic mentors. So, and I'm on the planning committee loosely because I'm way busy, as I'm sure everyone else is, through Nick Rosenkrantz. So, on to you, panelists.
Hi, my name's Bill. I'm Bill Bushey. I'm the lead organizer of Open Twin Cities. I'm also a part-time software engineer at GovDelivery, and I'm on the board of the Minnesota Coalition on Government Information. So how did I get on these like three things? There's like a common theme. My undergraduate education was computer science, and then I graduated from that and was like, I feel like I've gotten like half of my personal growth. There's a whole other missing thing here. So then I went to the Humphrey School and got a master's in science and technology policy. And as I was going through the Humphrey, everybody was like, oh, computing and public policy, that's like, yeah, that's such a great idea. That's going to be everything. And then I graduated and nobody would hire me. And so Open Twin Cities started in a way, I co-founded it with Alan Palazzolo. It was partly like, I want to try and create the job I want to have. And that's what brought me here today. And as far as like, what did I glean from this morning? Who figured out the horse thing? Who wants to figure out the horse thing?
Who looked it up and still didn't figure out the horse thing?
Afterwards, let's have like I just want to know the answer.
Hi, so I'm Alison Link. I currently work in academic technologies for the College of Liberal Arts. So we have a group called Liberal Arts Technologies and Innovation Services, buzzword innovation, germane to today. But how did I get there? I actually did my undergrad work in international relations and was always really interested in languages. So I think one lens that I try to bring to problem solving is a bit of thinking through the lenses of different languages as well, I've noticed. So that feels connected to innovation somehow. And then I kind of landed back in Minnesota without a plan and ended up doing some graduate work here at the University of Minnesota too. So I've just been really excited with kind of the resources coming out of the university. But I think what I'm also really excited about is how the university can be sort of used by the community as a place to, furnish some resources. So I think this Usability Day is a really great example of that. So that's something I kind of hope we keep thinking about of the university as a place for innovation, but also as citizens holding the university accountable for being open to the things that the communities need. So.
Hi, I'm Laura Andersen. I'm a service design strategist with a marketing agency called BlueSpire here in the Twin Cities. Previously, I worked closely with Bill Bushey with Open Twin Cities as a civic design lead, and in that role, facilitated a number of hackathons and service jams, which all required space for people to think innovatively. So hopefully I succeeded in doing that with Bill and others, and can share a little bit about that with you today. My undergrad was a long time ago, so totally irrelevant. They're like user experience didn't really exist back in the day. But I was an art history major and really have never done anything with that. Career was totally haphazard, I think the word. Just a lot of marketing, digital marketing, got into that, and then have worked with financial institutions, government partners, nonprofits, retail, pretty much all over the board. And still, and then recently, in the past 5 years or so, discovered the field of service design and have spent what I call my graduate years, 3 years, learning pretty much everything I could about that field and how it applies to the things that I'm interested in influencing in some sort of way. So working in that field now, and that's about it.
Hi, I'm Greg Howell. I'm the User Experience Manager at LeadPages. LeadPages is a landing page and marketing automation SaaS company here in the Twin Cities. Before that, I studied at the Savannah College of Art and Design. I have a very traditional design upbringing in that sense, and I actually started out my career in print and branding, which led me to wanting to do web design, which led me to want to do information architecture, which led me to want to understand how to do user testing and user interviews, which led me to UX. So it was a very long but kind of systematic entry into the user experience field.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, guys. I kind of put them on the spot there, so you guys, those were fantastic elevator pitches. You did a great job. So this morning, we kind of mentioned the idea that innovation as a buzzword, as a cool thing we want to do, a company tends to think of it as one way versus from the ground up, what innovation, as we think of it is, tends to be something different. So with the idea of that word that we don't know what it is, but it's a constant thing we know we need to do, through that lens, can you think of any physical spaces you have encountered that have helped people understand how to think or generate creative thinking? So kind of a quick example of that, I was talking to some people in the hallway about how companies like to say, open floor plan, collaboration, it'll be fantastic. And the first thing that happens when those walls come down is people put headphones on because it's so loud, nobody can think. So that's an example of how innovation up here is one thing, but it isn't conducive to actual innovating. So have you encountered any physical spaces or labs or anything like that that do work?
I had the first global service jam that I worked on, we partnered with the Mayo Center for Innovation down in Rochester, and had the opportunity to go down and see the space that they worked in. And they are a service design informed group down there working with different areas within Mayo to innovate in their service delivery in the hospitals and clinics. And that was probably the first space that I ever was able to visit that I saw really cool things that were actually used really well. Prior to that, I feel like I would see a lab or I would see some sort of creative space that was developed and it was beautiful and you would look at it and you just wanted to be in it. But this was the first time where I felt like the function really, really was there. And so they just prototyping materials and very active used space that didn't feel like it did. I think often when we look at creative spaces or these spaces with the intention to be innovative or do whatever they need to be doing, they can feel very exclusive, as though if you don't have a particular skill set or objective, you're not welcome in that space. And this was very, very integrated with their office floor plan, so it was just an extension of where they worked on the regular basis. And so I would encourage, if anyone has an opportunity to be invited to go down and visit the Mayo space, I think they're doing an excellent job of integrating that cool, innovative, creative space into their day-to-day space in a way that makes it super accessible to all the people that work there.
And I have a little bit of, I'm trying to think through, because as I was thinking back, I was sort of thinking through, are there places in history where we've seen innovation come out of? Are there spaces that are sort of traditionally used for exchange and innovation? And so when I thought about this a little bit too, I spent some time in Vienna and realized that historically the coffee shop in Vienna is a place that is sort of a public open space. It's a forum, it's a place for interchange, it's a place for casual encounters that wouldn't otherwise happen. So I guess rather than naming a specific space that I could point to, I think this philosophy of a coffee shop style area is really important to build in, and I actually did find a TED Talk that affirms this theory, so it's real. There's a guy on TED who says this too. So I think that idea I've really liked in hackathon spaces is I would see them as that sort of coffee shop with a little bit scoped sense of purpose as well. I think they fulfill that really well. The tension that I see with that is I think work doesn't always happen in a coffee shop in that way. So I think there's something about an innovative space where respecting the coffee shop space, respecting the public being, but then also having some rooms for that, I would call it lone genius kind of time. I don't want to, like highlight Steve Jobs or anything like that, but I do think there's some kind of lone genius moments that everybody needs to take. And so building that into spaces as well, I think there's some conversations about open spaces and the backlash on open spaces that there's not enough of that lone genius workspace. So those two things embedded in a place I think are important.
So just to ask real quick, do you remember or can you list what were the physical characteristics that make a coffee shop successful?
Yeah, I think one of the things I noticed, and I think the coffee shop takes a different role in today's society a little bit, but one of the things I noticed in Viennese coffee shops, the tables are, usually they'll fit like 4 or 5 people. They're kind of a little bit of a, kind of corner tables. You can do a lot of observation as well, so tables are along the edges and you can kind of observe things happening in the middle, and so everyone can take sort of an observer and an actor role at different times.
And I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can get beer in coffee shops in Vienna.
Well, the TED Talk guy says that beer actually is not conducive to innovation.
Is that the Balmer peak? Is that you can only get so up there before your innovation drops off?
Yeah, he says you need an upper.
That's for more of when you already know what it is you want to do, and
Right,
you just need to grunt through. I think to piggyback a little on what Allison is saying, like I think of when I sometimes go and work in public spaces, it's nice to have a space where you have the freedom to take a break. So I'd actually say, like, in the open work plan, I think one of the things that you sometimes see, or you sometimes see it half executed, is the idea of a lounge. Like a place where you can it's not natural to be working 8 hours straight. You do need a break, and then you'll go take a break, and you'll have conversations that have nothing to do with what you were doing. Maybe they will, and then suddenly you think, oh, yeah, that problem I couldn't, the finagle I could not figure that out before. But then I talked to Laura, and it's like now it makes sense.
Yeah, just to touch on what both of you have said, and then also Ree, what you mentioned about the pitfalls of a open floor plan work environment. There's a couple things that come to light that really can inhibit or raise that to actually work. One of them is, very systematically who's sitting near who. So obviously, if you have design sitting next to sales, that's probably not the best mix, as sales is making a lot of phone calls. They are going to be a little bit louder. So you want to encourage an environment where people don't actually have to sit with their headphones in. And the other huge part of this is not so much the open floor plan is a great idea in theory, only backed up and working well when you tie in the right culture. And the culture has kind of a place in this, in that the coffee shop that you bring up works so well because it's a very casual setting. I can think a little bit more freely. I don't feel so tied to my ideas. I can break off, go into different conversations. Oftentimes at LeadPages, we will have entirely different groups come over and enter into a conversation because we are very open to everybody's ideas. And some of the best insights that we'll get is just by a passerby coming into a space where we might be story mapping or something and saying, we're actually talking about some very similar things. We found out all of these, which begins to shape all of the conversations that are happening. So that's where open floor plan really succeeds, but I do think culture has to back it up. It has to be the right culture and fit for that to work well.
So kind of leading on that, even if you don't have a physical space in a place that you work today or a place you've worked previously, what are your personal physical spaces for innovation? What do you do for yourselves that allows you to get the creative juices flowing and get you in the zone and kind of let you be that mind that you need to be in order to get your job done?
There's scientific evidence that tall ceilings help with big ideas, which seems silly, but apparently, and that's, I don't know if you're familiar with the downtown Cocoa space, but I've always found, I worked at a Cocoa for about 3 years, and I would find that I could never really get work done there, but I did my absolute best thinking there. Whether I documented any of that thinking is, a different story. But I think there is a lot to be said for the light in the space and the not having a lot, sort of sparsity of area around you where you don't have a lot conflicting with what you're trying to think about or achieve or innovate on or ideate on, but you have that natural elements that are the light and trees and blue sky. And I know, for me at least, that's where I can't sit in my apartment with the low ceilings and I can type out 1,000 emails and get all the grunt work you need to get done in your day-to-day life. I'm awesome doing that at home. I can't think of a thing at home. And so I think there is something to be said for having that space for thought to occur in a physical way.
Yeah, so I was actually watching a really interesting talk with J.J. Abrams and Johnny Ive a couple weeks ago, and J.J. Abrams said something really that struck me that I do on an everyday basis, and I think about my own personal workspace that I had never really thought about before, but he likes to set up his space to be very beautiful. He likes working on a MacBook because it is very beautiful, and he has a certain set of pencils and notebooks because they are designed and pristine and mean something to him. But having that space that means something to you, you almost feel like you need to live up to that space, that to go in and do subpar work within that space is almost demeaning to the objects that you're working on, because you know that when you pick up your iPhone or you pick up your MacBook Pro, you're using a beautiful piece of software. Somebody put their heart and soul into that, and it's really hard to just say, well, I'll just do, whatever while you're using those sort of tools.
I agree with what Laura's saying about Cocoa. Just that big, airy space. It's inspirational. I'm going to keep going with the theme of laziness. I feel like sometimes if I need to be creative, and particularly if I need to write something, I need something to distract me. So I need a video game or something. So I'll maybe write a paragraph and then I'll go back and play some video games. And then maybe a little bit later, suddenly something pops up. So I again, kind of that fun diversion in a space, I find personally very, very helpful.
At the risk of sounding like a caffeine addict, I've known when I think about it, I do actually do most of my work in a coffee shop because I respond pretty well to ambient noise, although I do love the downtown library. I think the downtown library is a really great example of spaces for a lot of different styles of work. But I also think one thing I notice I do when trying to focus on people, so if I want to sort of set myself up to not be distracted by a cell phone or things like that, is actually pull out tea and kind of do a tea time. So in my work kind of with faculty or with folks where especially in technology, people are kind of get frustrated or they kind of see it as a tense thing, I'll bring a cup of tea, and I actually have had, faculty remark on that, oh, you come with a cup of tea. And I kind of do that because it shapes a different space of focus around a person and a relationship, I think, so.
I like that.
So we've mentioned a few physical spaces that meet these kind of bigger ideals, the freeing up of stuff in your brain. So like Coco and Mayo and the library. Are there any more physical spaces that you go to and you're just awestruck that you feel like should be more incorporated into an office environment? You look, yes, you have an answer.
I'm gonna go back to my outdoor theme. Take it outside. We do a lot of that. Bill and I have organized a number of hackathons and different types of events where we're trying. So, how many of you have participated in a hackathon or some sort of 1 or 2 day action packed where you're trying to solve a problem really quickly? You need to think quickly. And in a lot of what we've done, we've tried to incorporate some aspect of getting outside, because it either for gathering information, meeting with people, or just getting out of a space that feels very formal and very much like you don't. There's fewer guidelines on what you should be doing. What do you get outside? And I think it really frees up the mind and the creativity to come up with different types of ideas and approaches when you're in that different of a space than where you're used to doing work, unless you guys get to work outside, in which I'm incredibly jealous. It just doesn't
Until it's
feel
60
like
below.
workspace. What's that?
Until it's 60 below.
Well, yeah, that's a little bit different. So I would say, anytime you have an opportunity, especially with a team, where you can take some of that time that you need to spend really thinking on an idea and coming up with solutions, if there's any way that you can get outside to spend some time doing it in that environment, I think it'll be interesting to see what sorts of different types of results you get than you may get in doing it in a think tank or in a more, office-y type creative space.
Yeah, actually, I was definitely going to say outside. Fortunately, I live a few blocks from the river, and it's just always great to go out and look out at the river. And we're very lucky in the Twin Cities. We actually have very ready access to some beautiful outdoor space in parks and in our natural features. I'll also suggest the art museums. Last year, we Open Twin Cities got to participate with a number of other organizations in a co-working experiment at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And it is just so great to be working on something and then think, I need a break, I'm gonna go walk out and I'm gonna peruse some world-class art. And then eventually something will like hook me and I'll just stare at it for a while, kind of like, it's like, how does that work? And again, suddenly, I'm no longer hyper-focused on the thing I was trying to work on. And then those are sometimes moments when random new ideas come out.
So,
I was going to bring it back indoors for a second, too. So one of the things I think we've seen in academic conversations recently, and if you've gone to even K-12 schools, I think are talking about this a lot, too, is the breaking down the computer lab theory of where to put things. So we've seen a little bit of that on campus. I actually think some folks in here were even involved in that. I think like Noah, if you see him here, we're involved in, and Kristen maybe rethinking the spaces that we have on campus. So we used to have a lot of computer labs with this idea that they would be sort of a single use, everything's going to happen in this way, everyone's going to work in lockstep together and follow through a course. And we still have some of those, but I think now we've changed some spaces, and I could even name some on campus if you all are here and have some time later. McGraw Library has a Smart Learning Commons that's focused more on this modular pod style. Hewlett Humphrey Center, HHH 50 on West Bank has a really good example of that too. And you've probably seen that in your spaces as well, but I think education just had this very lab-focused thought that things would be single use, and that's how you do technology. And I think we're all realizing that's not the way things work. There's, I think, a parallel in architecture. Has anyone read Jane Jacobs? It's this giant tome of, I got like a third of the way through the book. But the part that I did read, she talks about mixed use spaces, and I think, and how they're safer in cities to have commercial and residential and things together, so there's always different things happening throughout the day. So I think the corollary in our spaces as well, in our internal spaces, is helpful.
So that's actually a perfect lead into the next question. Innovation kind of stems from that moment of exposure to that uncomfortable or something that breaks your mental memory of what you think things should be. Can you think of some physical spaces that either do a really good job of breaking your expectations in a way that kind of shakes your mind free, or do a really bad job of that sort of thing?
I think anytime you have the opportunity to get into the space that you're trying to solve a challenge for. So in service design, we do a lot of work around ethnographic research and service safaris and that sort of thing. So we make it a very important part of any challenge that we're trying to address, be it, quality of care, a number of millions of services, but making sure that you actually get into the space to see how whatever it is that you're looking at is actually occurring. It's so hard sometimes to really get to the root of how different people's experiences are than what you have every day. Even if you have very good intentions, you can't not see it when you're in it. So often when you're trying to solve a problem that's in a context that you're not that familiar with, getting into that context and inserting yourself in a way that's comfortable for the people who are needing to be there can really be the key to breaking through what the real human challenges are that you're trying to address, and really bring to light some different types of solutions that you may not have considered had you not spent the time in that space.
So I think the question was sort of how do you build in an encounter with the other into a space, maybe, would be how I'd interpret it. So I think I'm going to hit back on the international relations trope, but if you can build something like a study abroad moment into your work, this is something I don't do nearly enough in my life, so I'm going to leave here and try to find ways to do this. But it's not as much about a physical space, but if you can latch onto a thing that feels like study abroad, you're completely disrupting your patterns, you're a foreigner in a place. So maybe job shadowing somebody at a parallel institution to yours, or, for me, I'm in higher ed, going to K-12. It's related but a very different universe. Something that I think study abroad really shakes up people's sense of identity in really creative ways. I think also even just the power of immigrant literature. You see people being displaced and they end up being very creative and have a very rich imagination around things and a very rich conversation about identity and novelty. So if you can build that into your life with people, think about that.
Yeah, I would add to that with Cedar Riverside is a fantastic area if you want to put yourself in a culture that is, you might not be the dominant culture for once. Same thing with Frogtown in various areas because we do have high immigrant populations. I actually had that experience after climbing one day at Midwest Mountaineering. We went to this tiny little Somali-owned restaurant that didn't even have a sign out front or a menu because the people who went there always got like the same 12 things because it was just their third space to go to. But there was something really awesome about this guy's chai that it tickled me in a way that I don't think anything else would have. So yeah, I agree with that.
Just to touch on both of those sort of topics, even if you can't get out into the physical space, which is the kind of preferred method, really, instead of just empathizing with somebody, it's much harder to ignore things that you wouldn't even imagine could be troubles or problems that people have in their everyday life when you're actually in that physical space. But one of the things you can also try doing is just living a life of what the person that has this problem might be, and sometimes reaching out to different groups within your own organization and sitting with them in their space with a customer success or a retention, and listen in on their calls and listen to the actual tone in people's voices when they're having the problem that you're trying to solve. It becomes vastly more difficult to ignore the fact that these are real people with real problems, and that is a mental space that you should really always try to encounter to really truly be innovative.
I'm just writing that down. It's the one downside to being a moderator is that taking notes becomes a little bit more difficult. Okay, so we talked about the good of an innovative space, and we touched a little bit this morning on how it can be hard when you have business decisions and sales type people, and people who look at bottom lines, asking you, what's the ROI of this space? And you have to say stuff like, well, soft skills are important. We learned them in kindergarten. You can't put $1 on please and thank you. So do you have any tips or tricks that you've used in relation to an innovative space, or also more generally, to get some of those business people to not fear like failure and calculated risk a little bit, to actually be willing to take the steps towards an innovative space?
I think that's actually one strategy Open Twin Cities has been executing on, is kind of taking, well, what are those baby steps? What's the cheap way to try this? And so the events, the hackathons and events that Laura mentioned, those are relatively inexpensive to do. You can pull one off for a couple $1,000s. And so that can be, I think, a good way to get toes wet of organizations that are maybe like, they hear the buzzword, hashtag innovation, and they're like, we want to do that. And boy, we keep hearing about these things. So yeah, let's just do one and we'll see what happens. And then, a lot of these things that we're talking about are not something new. Other places around Minnesota, around the world, are doing these kinds of things. So there are examples to point to say, like, this is the kind of new thing that came out of, putting your team in a beautiful space, or putting your people in a space where they all kind of start mixing together and people talk who didn't usually talk before.
Yeah, I think the big thing to do in trying to create an innovative space is have some desired outcomes, have some way that even internally yourself you can qualify whether this is working or not working. Otherwise, you're always going to come back to that same point of what is the return on investment to the business for this. So even if that is you can point to the increase in productivity, you can increase the quality of the product that's coming out, you can point to the decrease in wasted time and effort and frustration. Whatever that is, you should always try to, just like anything in our work, back things up with data in some meaningful way that will, in my mind, probably help with some of those challenges.
Yeah, and I think related to that is to have a serious discussion about what it is you're actually trying to do, and make sure you have metrics for actually measuring outcome. It can be pretty easy to create metrics that kind of measure the happening of a particular strategy. So maybe it's like number of hits to a website. Well, maybe what you're trying to do is reduce homelessness. Well, if your innovative process comes up with a totally different strategy that has no website, then you need to make sure you've talked about, yeah, there are now 0 visits to the website because we don't have one anymore. That was good, actually.
Awesome. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just trying to think, and that's a tough one.
Yeah, that's kind of the big one.
Work for people who are already on board.
That's my strategy.
That's mine.
Yeah, pick your battles, figure out which ones you're going to have to fight less hard at, try to make those go forward.
And find your network. I mean, that's another reason Open Twin Cities got started, is there are people who are open to this kind of thinking in the Twin Cities. And yeah, if you're working in a place where this isn't happening, maybe you can talk to somebody who is doing this kind of thing. And yeah.
Sweet. Okay, so we have one more question here that I'm just going to read directly because I think it's really well written. Without a champion or sponsor to shepherd innovative ideas along, even the most innovative things fail to launch. A certain galvanizing force seems to be necessary before an innovation can find its own footing. What are some ways you've seen innovative ideas find success, even if they don't have a traditional sponsor along the ride? Another big one.
Yeah, I think that definitely not having a sponsor is challenging. And I think that, for one thing, collaboration very rarely comes from an individual, or collaboration obviously doesn't come from an individual. Innovation very rarely comes from an individual. It generally comes from some sort of collaborative process. And at least what I'm talking about now, it comes more from a collaborative process. And I think the larger group of people that you're able to bring into that process that results in that innovative idea, the more advocacy you build that raises awareness about a broad swath of people who are interested in the success of whatever the idea is, which can grab the attention of potential sponsors within an organization who may not be anyone that you have direct access to. So I think when things get precious, when people want to take credit for innovative ideas, I think that's the death knell of an innovative idea. But when you have a group of people who are advocating together for the success of that, and really for the success of that and not the success of themselves, is when you get the attention of people who are able to support it and willing to take more risk in supporting the idea, or at least giving it a chance.
This might sound like a cop-out answer, but I realize that there have been some situations where I've had to reshape my sense of what success might be, I think, because, so how does innovation find success without a sponsor? I think encouraging people engaged in, and I think this happens actually a lot in hackathons, for example, encouraging people to, rather than focusing on sort of the big, we're going to build the app tool thing, and then there's a thing, and it's an app, and then nobody's going to take care of it, and then it's, it might end up on Amazon Web Services, and then, or not. I think reshaping and encouraging people to think about what actually did happen. So I think in a lot of community spaces, look at the connections that happen that wouldn't have otherwise happened. Look at success as, was a conversation started that would never have been galvanized otherwise. And then somehow finding a way to capture then beyond that, what that catalyzed. I think Chad was a really good example, the Campus Code Fest we've had. I think if you look at, possibly from the university level, they'd say, okay, well, what projects got finished at a Code Fest? And I think that's less of an interesting question and more of what community continues after a Code Fest, that when I have a question, rather than reinventing the wheel in my silo, I'm going to go ask this person. And that's a lot harder to capture, the what would you call it, the wake of a thing. But so I think hackathons have this really important need to redefine success, to be able to, away from like product focus into sort of outcomes focused, people focused things. I think there's probably parallels in other situations too, but.
I'd say if you've created something and there's not a person or an organization that can really carry it forward, then this sounds like you've made a thing that's in search of a problem, which this came up earlier this morning, and that's good. I think that's a good time to put it out in the commons, open source it, or let clearly you're not using it, let somebody use it. The person who's having the problem, or the organizations that's having the problem, they'll find the innovation, and then that's when it will really start to take off. I actually, the other day, I just watched something about, PBS has this thing, like How We Got to Now, and they talked about timekeeping, clocks. And they kind of started off with Galileo, when he was like 19, he figured out pendulums could keep time. But he didn't really have the capacity to actually turn that into something. And so then later in his life, he shared it with somebody else who actually went on to like submit to a competition that was then able to like create devices to help people sail. So yeah, science.
I think to that question, you've really got to consider why this didn't move forward, and look back at it and say, was it a technology hurdle? Was it an idea hurdle? Was it an infrastructure hurdle? And I think a lot of times why it didn't move forward can be telling in the future of how you should approach it differently. Again, going back to that, how do you mark success? Was it a failure in your ability to meet the expectations of an organization or a space? Or was it a failure of that organization to realize that this innovative thing, product, whatever, had the ability to do something extraordinary? And those are very different outcomes.
All right, one more hopefully easy question. If there was one thing that you think is the death of innovation, besides siloing, because we've said that like a dozen times, what would the one thing be?
I'm going to go back to preciousness, holding it too tightly and wrapping it up too much in yourself. And I think we all sort of spoke to that in some way. The idea has to become available to a community that supports it, to get it in the right direction, to understand the problem that it needs to solve, to understand, is it really solving a problem, or is there some other part of it? Is it a piece of someone else's brain trust that's going to create something you could never even have imagined? So I think too much pride of authorship or pride of ownership can really get in the way of letting the idea advance. So separating the advancement of the individual from the idea, I think, can really help allow that idea become what it can become.
I think a variation of that is, I always get really concerned when we get hyper-focused on a specific technology, be it some website or app. To me, that digital artifact is not the innovative thing. The innovative thing is the process that led to the creation of that, and hopefully the process that will continue to lead to the improvement of that. So I think when we focus far too much on the tangible, to the extent something digital is tangible, I think that's a death nail to innovation.
So kind of in a similar vein to both of those comments, innovation or creativity in general is incredibly fragile when it's birthed, and creating a space that allows for it to come to life and have room to grow before really chastising it or taking it for what you see at its face value is really important. You need to give designers, engineers, product managers, whatever your organization has, the ability to create an idea and give it some room to grow. All too often you will see where something comes to light and somebody will immediately squash it, which has a profoundly negative effect on that person's ability to come up with something new and creative in the future.
And the people who hear that crushing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, well, and maybe to pick up on that, I think if there's one thing that would stifle innovation, I'd say it's killing intrinsic motivation, which feels, so I think most innovation does come from people being able to do more because they're intrinsically motivated. I took a fun class on gamification and was brought into this conversation around what are some fundamental parts of intrinsic motivation. There's some good literature that talks about, there's sort of 3 pillars that I'm sure there are a lot of pillars that people have talked about, but people need a feeling of competence, people need a feeling of, I wrote this down because I like this, autonomy, and people need a feeling of relatedness. And if you kill any of those things, especially in the early phases, I think, if somebody comes out and puts themselves on the line and then it's quashed in a way that they no longer feel competent, they're not gonna stick their necks out in that way. If they no longer feel like they're related to a group process, if it's cordoned off in a certain way and it's not related to a broader whole, people get really demotivated. So guarding well.
Thanks, panel. I'd like to open it up to the room. Do you have any questions for the panel on how to create a space that is conducive to innovative thinking? Got a question over here?
So I think this sort of relates. If you have a group who is working together on a project that requires creativity, but you don't have a physical space to occupy, how can you create like the same sort of solutions that we're talking about here?
So this one is really interesting to me because I worked for 1.5 years in our University of Minnesota Extension, which does a lot of remote collaborations. So most of our work, we weren't in the same physical space, And we have a lot of remote offices around the state. And I think the thing that, so I'm thinking more in the remote collaboration situation, and you'll have to kind of apply this to your own, but I think there's something that when you don't have the same physical space, there's a part of group work that involves relational focus. So there's, I think in the leadership literature, there's this talk about relationship focus and task focus. And I think the relationship things are ones that can easily get lost, probably task focus as well, but taking extra effort to build relationships in clever ways, I think is probably important. And this is something I wish we'd done more of when we did remote collaborations, is deliberately building into the beginning of every meeting something relational. So some icebreaker, some kind of, and prioritizing that as, so what's one thing you've been reading recently? What's a problem that's been sitting on your mind? It can also relate to the thing at hand, but knowing that you're going to need to take some extra time to build that sense of peoplehood around each other.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking, so if the team is like all in, it's like one metro area and you just don't have an actual space, like that's kind of how Open Twin Cities operates. So creativity in terms of what actually defines the space, and I guess an ability to, do your thinking in a way that you can easily pack up and move somewhere else. But I think the remote work is really interesting. It's probably the more difficult. I'd say, I guess, to add to what Alison said, when you get into a remote workspace or remote works situation, it's easy to forget that you're all actually working together at the same time. It's easy to get into the space of like, we'll open up a Google Doc and then you add something to it when you have time. Well, that's just completely killed off the relationship piece. So just because you don't have a space doesn't mean you still can't set up the same time to work together, because then you can still use the technology to help enable the collaboration and discussion.
Well, and one more theory I think I've developed recently that relates to this a little bit too is I think every office or every team needs a water cooler, and it can happen anywhere. We've been using Slack more in what I keep calling the virtual water cooler, but something where casual chatter can happen regardless of where you are and increasingly regardless of what time of day it is and that you can pick up on. So just know that if you don't have a water cooler, you may not be moving forward the way you could be or should be.
Other questions for the panel?
Do you have any more examples of water coolers?
Slack is a good one.
What is it?
HipChat.
HipChat. Yeah, I mean, I guess some kind of real-time chat. This can go way back to like IRC. That actually still is used, especially amongst programmers. That's used a lot. Twitter can actually be a great water cooler.
Yeah, actually, thank you for bringing that up. Do you mind if I jump in?
Go for it.
So when I started developing an interest in this field of service design, there really wasn't anyone doing service design, and my space became #service design in Twitter, and through that network that I was able to interact with and establish, I actually was able to plan a 6-week trip through Europe where I was meeting with different service design agencies, academics, and individuals practicing in the field, and do a course of very short-term internships with each of them, and that all happened as a result of Twitter. And so I wouldn't have thought of it that way until I realized that I've kind of used it that way. So I don't know, Twitter for me before that was like, I have no idea how to use Twitter. I have no idea what the value of it was, but when I found a specific thing that I was very interested in, it really did become that, and now I know those people IRL.
You can buy somebody beer on Twitter too.
What?
There's some startup somewhere. You can do it.
I'm gonna have to Google that.
More than emoji beer.
IRL beer?
It might involve sending an emoji beer, and then yeah.
All right. Do you guys have any closing thoughts that you're like, oh, I thought of this thing and I need to say it?
Can I just throw a little headspace thing in there?
Totes?
Um,
You did say
I
IRL, by the way. I can say totes.
Oh my God, I'm very connected to my jacket right now via Velcro. I think headspace is equally as important, and I don't know, did anyone watch Mr. Robot? There's this whole thing that he talks about how the daemons are going on in the back of your head, but no matter what you're thinking about, you're always thinking about the problems that you're trying to solve, even if you're not actively thinking about it. And it's generally when you're not actively thinking about it that actually the ideas start coming to you, and you can think about things more clearly because you're not so cluttered and clouded. And I think when you're entering into, whether it be a hackathon or some sort of brainstorming workshop, you're envisioning that you would like something innovative to come out of it in your space, make it as casual as possible so that people don't come into it with the mindset of, this is my day-to-day job, this is my work. Encourage, wear jeans, have Legos, have things around that get people out of a work mindset and can help them think about things that aren't related necessarily to work. Alison just had the Game Storming book out, which is a great thing to use to generate that casual creativity that has an astounding ability to bring out new and exciting ideas that are very often and very infrequently brought out through traditional office-y brainstorming methods. So that casual mind space can really do amazing things. And I say this because I've seen it when people are encouraged to think differently. But when they're given an opportunity via how they're told to act in a space, regardless of what that space looks like, that, I don't know, I'm just babbling now, but that casual mind space is very helpful.
And I think some nice framing language I found around that too. I think the space you're talking about, that affirmative space that creates a sense of belonging, I think, and you talked about this a little bit too, there's a lot of affective things that go into a space. It's not just physical. One thing I've really liked is if you look up principles of an unconference, Chad mentioned this a little bit earlier too, is, the right people are in the room right now, whatever happens today is the only thing that could have happened. And just affirming, so look up principles of an unconference and getting people in that sense of belonging, anything can happen here, and giving them a certain kind of agency. As an organizer of a space, I think that's sort of your duty to enable that. And if you're noticing people are getting emotional affective blocks, it's probably because you didn't do that right to begin with. So.
Just another key word that's related to this is safe space. Really anybody who comes should feel comfortable saying or doing like what comes to their mind. That's all I got.
Yeah, and that kind of, to me, always gets back to the culture of the organization that you're creating. So is that safe space with everybody? You would hope so, but if it's not, then as an organizer of that meeting, as an organizer of that project, you always want to make sure to invite the correct people at the correct times to really peak that innovation.
Cool. Something that two of you guys kind of touched on, that it was one of those I wouldn't have thought about it except for that I just heard it things. One of the things that I did at my job that freaked people out, and I had no idea it was going to freak people out, we have huge laminated desks. A giant white laminated desk is a whiteboard, right? So I've got this teeny tiny whiteboard that's behind my second monitor and behind a cactus, and it's got my nameplate on it. So there's roughly a foot of whiteboard space. So I went out, I bought whiteboard markers in like 25 colors, because you gotta color code stuff, and I started drawing on my desk. I did a spot test, and it starts to mark after like 6 months, so don't leave it on there for 6 months. But I wrote down stuff in flowcharts and like whiteboards, whatever I was just working on, thinking about at that moment, and all of the developers looked at me like I was crazy. They're like, can you do that? And I'm like, well, I just did it, so yes. Also, you can too. But now, after I've been at this company for like 9 months, people will come over to my desk because they're like, I have to talk about a thing with you. Can I draw on your desk? I'm like, yes, you can. There are the markers. There are the whiteboard wipes. And they start whiteboarding. Developers, front end and back end, will start making mock-ups and user flows on my desk. Take a picture of them, put them in Confluence. Everybody has them now. So that's like my small way of being like, hey, you can do stuff too. It's fun. All right, so we are at 1:30. I would like to thank our panelists again, Bill Bushey, Alison Link, Laura Andersen, and Greg Howell. Can we get a hand for them? Awesome. And we have a short break at 1:45. We'll be doing a design thinking dual presentation.